So we are recording now, and I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. That helps me to keep in the road here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share that screen, and hopefully we will, crossing my fingers now. Can everyone see this slide?
Not yet.
So you can see the slide saying Remembering America, right?
Not
No.
yet.
No.
No?
No.
What do you see? What
You.
about now? Oh, wait a second. Helps if I click the share button. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, yeehaw, we're in the right place at the right time. Okay. Really what he wants us to do is he talks about in the beginning, and being the pious man that he is, in the beginning are the first words of Genesis, obviously. But he talks about Washington, Jefferson, and this little meditation on the side he does about the face of Lincoln. Now, this was, by my count, about 150 pages. So I totally understand if nobody was able to get through this, and I hope this will be fruitful even if you've not been able to get through this. But what I kind of want us to begin to engage with here is this notion. I'm going to move this around a little bit so I can see better on this bigger screen. So I'm looking at you. Okay. What I want us to kind of see here is, first of all, an attempt to reclaim two founding fathers that are really in the crosshairs now. One of them, of course, is George Washington. The other is Thomas Jefferson. And to an extent, even Abraham Lincoln, that we're going to put here as a little final meditation. I don't like this because I can't see you all very well, so I hope you'll let me know if I'm at all interesting or not, okay? So please don't be shy. He's laughing, so, you know, I'm trying to see a few faces there. Okay, on what I've got going here. So here we go. One of the first things I wanted to begin with right here is this image. He talks a lot about patriotism and the sacred. And one of the things I wanted to say just with these three images, what is one of our most sacred icons in our nation is the American flag. Now, looking in the middle of the images there, you would see somebody who, depending on how you feel about it, might find this to be totally appropriate. It's not like an American flag bikini. You know, somebody's wearing a fairly modest dress in the shape of the American flag. They might be going to a 4th of July parade or a party, right? You know, this is someone who's showing patriotism. On the other extreme to the right is actually an image of the parliament in Iran, burning American flag images. You know, we would see that obviously as a desecration of what we consider to be a sacred American symbol. Somewhere in the ambiguous, though, would be the image to the left. Because some people might look upon hijabs in Islam as being problematic. They might be disconcerted and upset with someone who would wear an American flag hijab, a veil, as this woman does in this image that's being held up here at a protest. Some people might think that this is just the kind of protest people want to see. This is what America is. We're no longer, you know, this is someone who would be an American. It's interesting for me to point out that the woman whose photograph they use for this objects to this image, because for her, she's a Muslim woman who wears an hijab. This was superimposed over an image of her, and she's like, I'm a person, not an icon. Don't use this image. So some of the things that we could probably contemplate here to imagine is that there really is, you know, for the Muslim clerics in Iran on the right, their burning of these images of the American flag are, to us, desecrations. To them, it's a political statement. For them, something else is sacred. So sacredness is something that has, it's a matter of intent. And I would say very much, and I think Needleman argues, it's a matter of context as well as content. And so in that sense, I kind of want us to jump into this thing because that's where he begins. What he wants us to sort of do, and there we go, I want to stress just a little definition. Sacred, we're used to this. Sacred, not holy, but sacred, consigned to be considered to be deserving respect, and also something that's considered to be important, too important to be changed. And we might even go so far as to use a word that we played with last week. You'll remember about existential and essential. The eternal is essential. You see? So in that sense, we're beginning to talk about the sacred as something that we think is respect, deserving of our respect, that should be considered unchanging, that it's a consistent reality for us. And lastly, something that's essential. And in that sense, we might think of it as being the eternal. Now, one of the things he says is a sacred element for us is this idea of the respect for our neighbor as almost a definition of democracy. And here, looking from page 33 to 34 in his book, he says, I am now saying that what we call the ethical, the moral, the spiritual, the American, or any other value system finds its ultimate support and foundation in the experience of pure human presence. Now, I love this. And this image from Norman Rockwell, I hope you laugh at when you see it. I mean, obviously, it says Dewey and Truman are the two characters that are being argued in this image. And you see the husband, obviously a Dewey fan, the wife who is obviously the Truman fan. I love the baby who looks like it just wishes it could die. And even the dog and cat want to be somewhere else. But in this essence, what's happening in this democracy is the two of them are doing something that we're increasingly failing to do. They're engaging with each other. Now, are they vehement? Are they passionate? Are they disagreeing? But they are respecting each other. They're actually engaging with each other. And part of what he tries to say in this lengthy sentence is the essence of what we need to be able to do to be able to have this idea of a shared ethic, moral, spiritual experience is that it comes from how we experience it together. The abstraction, if it's just an idea, if it's something that we don't really get into together, it's something that we can't really call something that is a moral, a spiritual, or an ethical imperative. And it says here that it is only this experience that makes possible authentic freedom of speech and action, or independence of the mind and heart, and what we might call self-reliance, term from Emerson. And I love this, or true respect for my neighbor, democracy. In brief, the ideals of America can point us to a sacred inner state we have almost entirely lost this meaning of in America. And I find this to be a wonderful notion that at the heart of this is our unwillingness to let the other one away. You know, the phrase that I like to use that I think is the most damaging one we do now in our country today is the idea of dismissal. We dismiss people out of hand. We think it's pointless to begin the conversation. We just don't bother. Now, one of the great characters from American history that refused to do that in his time and in his context was Martin Luther King. It's one thing to hurl a bomb, to be violent, to want to force change. It's another thing to, as King did with nonviolent social justice, nonviolent non-cooperation, was to, by engaging people, not passively, quite dynamically, relentlessly, but non-violently, it was his way of helping essentially his oppressor, his racist oppressor, know and understand the error of what they were doing. It was a new kind of language that he learned from Gandhi in India against the British. The idea of doing something that was in and of itself believed that even Bull Connor, if you remember him, the chief of police in Alabama that would sit there and use the water cannons and things like, attack dogs, even he could be changed if he could see what was happening, if someone was willing to engage with him. And if argument couldn't do it because they didn't see them as being equal, they chose to do it in a way that made it impossible for them to ignore. And the thing that when we dismiss someone, when we go over to our little section of the internet and they go to theirs, is that we lose this necessary reality, this human experience of each other that allows for some change to go. Even with this duet on this picture from Norman Rockwell, who certainly look like their minds are well made up. But it's something to be seen there, I think. Now, what are the true basis, he says here, for moral ideals? Thank you, David, for catching this. It said moral ideas until I edited it with the last 5 minutes where people showed up. But the basis of moral ideals, he says, we need to understand what for us is the real meaning of sacred in human life. Now, one of the things I wanted to show you inside this very famous, I think it's not Rodin, I can't remember who the sculptor is, but it's supposed to be the two natures of man, two sides of humanity that are always in struggle, and one will have ascendancy over the other at one point or another, but sees humanity as two wrestlers trying to see which one will have the preeminency at one point or another. He says, certainly we need accurate historical facts and plausible hypotheses, but above all, we need a sense of what a human being is and can become. When we think of an opponent of ours, we may only see the part of them in this constant battle of the internal human being, of two sides, of good and evil, of right and wrong, of agreement and disagreement, that are in constant struggle. And we may think that the other one will never win or can never be drawn out. But we have time and again the opportunity of seeing that that can happen. He goes on to say, only with that it is possible to venture into the study of history and intuit what is essential, and through it, to initiate a conversation with the past that serves our present need. So if we need to be able to look into the past to be able to understand how we can speak to each other in the present, we have to be ready to look at the past with the same sort of respect and gentle eyes, not being idyllic, seeing these two characters at battle at all times. Now, if you've read into the book, you've heard him talk about a very prescient, very self-aware moment that comes in Philadelphia, his hometown, at the Franklin Museum of Science and Technology. And he talks about being at a train. Some of you have already told me that this meant a lot to you. It meant a lot to me. This is from years ago, a picture that I had taken of myself in the train that he was at. So this, when you hear that passage, I wanted you to see the immense size of the steam locomotive that he was so enthralled with, that had given him such an idea of the power of ideas and human abilities to employ ideas in the physical world, and got one of my children to take a photograph of me inside the engineer's cabin of that steam locomotive. So if you were wondering about that, that's the engine right there. And it's quite big, as you can see from the people standing next to it.
On the safety cord?
Yeah.
Also, because I love art, and I hope you'll recognize these from the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. These are for the 4 stages of man. I tried to show the adolescent here. He talked about his own individuation, his own argument of his trying to turn away his parents, he thought, permanently, and their teachings. Much like this image shows, the man, you notice, his guardian angel has left him because he's expelled him. And what he wants to do is he's going to go into the rapids by himself. He's going to blaze a new trail, he thinks, in his idea of becoming himself. And what he says, in my adolescence, I consciously turned away from the religion of my grandparents in my childhood. I remembered a sense of who I was that began to develop in me. He says, I was just myself and felt a sense of becoming uniquely me, although as I see now, right under the surface, a very thin surface, I knew I did not know who or what I was. This idea of, even in his questionings, he admonishes us to be humbled by it. That what we are so certain of today and within our convictions, we may find ourselves yet being held up by it when we find out years later how wrong we were. And what he tells us here, and I use this image of the child with everything before him from that same set of images, America is not a tribal, ethnic, or racial identity. I think this is one of the greatest lines, this paragraph from the entire book. It is not a tribal, ethnic, or racial identity. It is a philosophical identity composed of ideas of freedom, liberty, independent thought, independent conscience, self-reliance, hard work, justice. This is both the weakness and the strength of America. To love America is not to love one's roots. It is to love the flower that is not yet bloomed, the fruit as yet unripened. To love America is to love the future. And I'm so enamored with this phrase because as I've tried to tie in just, let you know, I'm doing this in Lent. This has got a point in a church. This is how really the Christian aspect of things are. We're fully aware of who we are as human beings with our sinful nature as well as our redeemed nature. And we don't look back and say, this is who we are. We don't look at each other and say, 10 years ago, you were this kind of person who did this. We don't even look at who we are now per se, as much as we believe that in all of us is the inaugurated effort of God to make us into something we will one day be. And this is what we look forward to. We're engaging with something that brings us to a place that is something that is not yet there. And if we can do that on the whole with our country, and even personally with ourselves, we can really begin to do it with each individual that we engage with. The people in our lives that we think are hopeless, today maybe. It's a very Protestant thing, a very evangelical thing to believe, like being born again. We can change, God bless you. We can change overnight. We can be someone different. So he asks a question that I think is really true. This idea of a mystic core. Do we actually have one? God bless you again.
Every time I eat.
And the ideas of human equality and independence in these communities are rooted in the notion that God, or if you don't want to think of God, the inner light inside of us, exists within every human being, and that the aim of life revolves around the endeavor and the necessity for every man or woman to make a conscious contact with this inner divine force. This interior divinity is the source of true happiness, intelligence, and moral capacity, and is meant to be the guide and ultimate authority in the conduct and assessment of our lives and obligations. And this is so powerful to me, because this is something that we're losing. For most people to be able, the definition of freedom for many of us now, I think both as Americans, but also as Christians, is I'm off the hook. I can do whatever I want. And we're guided by our instincts and desires, as opposed to what Needleman describes here as being our better angels, our wills that are something that actually has its root, its foundation in something sacred, in something divine even. Drawing us back to that's one of the most important things. And I in this image, I want to draw out something important. It's obviously Mary with Jesus from an icon. And I use an Eastern Orthodox icon for this reason. The Eastern Church calls Mary a word, the Theotokos, which is Greek for God bearer. What happens for us, as he says here, let me just read his quote. Seen from this perspective, no human being can have ultimate authority over another. A human being is his own authority only because he has within him the inner Christ, the inner divinity. And this moral compass, this spark of the divine that guides us into truth and goodness, is not only our privilege and an enjoyable benefit, it's our obligation, because like Mary, we're the God bearer. If this is something inside of us that is uniquely given to us as a piece of God to direct us in our own lives, but in our public sphere as well, then it becomes something for us to see it as a really holy gift that we're stewards of, something that we have an obligation to handle well. We can't just, as the Bible says, put a bushel on our light, on our flame. We have to use it to light our way and to help others with that light. So there is a moral obligation to be the bearer of that divine piece of us that is our moral compasses. He talks about something I think is kind of neat, this idea of the mind on the side of God. There's two minds. There's the one that's on our side. And the part of that mind inside are some of those two wrestling characters. The other one is that part of the mind of God that is engaged and trying to direct us. He says, I also find myself trying to understand for myself and on my own the demands and claims of religion and all the forms of authority that culture presented to me. This is him as a teenager. In my most intimate self, there was thought, the mind, perception, seeing, understanding, pondering, wondering, imagining. No matter what happened to me, no matter what I was told, no matter what I feared or loved or hated, no matter what was disappointing came my way, or pain or injustice, there in myself, it was myself, there was my mind, my thought, my awareness, informed by great ideas. Do we teach ourselves these great ideas? I think we do at church. I want to argue that here at St. John's, we talk about the great ideas of our Judeo-Christian teachings, but how much do we hear these things? We hear a lot about, I mean, we were joking earlier here at the church where we engaged about Dr. Seuss. You know, what we're looking at here is, does Dr. Seuss offend me? Because of her image or something about that. And you know, this is interesting, because what we do is we've now disengaged from Dr. Seuss. It would even be worse to disengage from anyone, in the sense that that they may yet affect us, and indeed we may yet affect them. But also it's because when we do that, sometimes we can be left only with one part of our mind overpowering the other, maybe the one that's not on the side of God. He says, my strongest and deepest connection with the need to act came from the sense that really good or right actions could emanate, and perhaps could only emanate, from that inner mind which was myself and was on the side of God.
Beautiful.
This notion that we need to be connected, knowing that inside of us is a battle, and that we have an obligation to listen and to seek out that side which is in league with God. I like the idea that he tries to explain to us this idea of religion. I mean, I do give Thomas Jefferson a kick in the teeth every chance I get. But, you know, in reality, these were guys that had a kind of a different thing about what religion means than maybe what I do. When the Founding Fathers held up reason in the place of religious faith, they're dealing at a time in which dogma and conformity was something that had to do with as much politics as the church, especially an established religion. Where they advocate the kind of intellectual activity that figures so prominently in our present culture, in science, education, and the professions. He says, I think not. Our own exaggerated logical mind, he says, stands between ourselves and material instruments that require the engagement of the body and the will. He's telling us that in order to run that giant, powerful locomotive of ideas, that this instrument, this technological instrument that we saw, it was not only just the push the button so the engine worked. It was the idea of being able to create something this huge that wasn't just impressive in its own right, but it was made to do something. It was made to move furniture and people and raw materials. It was a brilliant idea that you could make something that massive that a single man's hand could control.
Come, Sassy. Come on, Tucker.
What's that?
It's
He's talking to the door.
Oh, good. I just want to make sure. Okay. I did like one thing here I wanted to draw out as well, and I hope you find it this interesting, is the idea that he says the art, the great art of America is our government. This idea, I love this. I once had a professor wisely say that technology is the humanities of science. But for a people that are founded in a very special way, we'll hear from Washington about this, but people founded in a very special way, government is our humanities, our art. It's what we as a people offer. We have all the other ones. We have music, we have all these other visual arts, etc. But what's so fascinating is that it seems to be our national identity and unique national identity to have given this world this idea of this sort of government that we have. I love what he says here. Let those who ask what of transcending stature our nature is created turn their eyes to our form and structure of government. That is the American art, a work of human hands and minds that can stand in a certain way alongside many of the greatest achievements in the history of the world. And we don't value it, I think, as much today. And what's worse is, I think we're forgetting how to actually exercise this incredible tool and gift we have. Now, I promised you a little bit of Franklin. And this is why I say we're so unique. This phrase, he says, chance, war, and conquest. To the founders of America, to Franklin, Jefferson, Washington, and Adams, these were the only factors that history showed as the origins of nature: chance,
Nations.
war, contact. That's what I said, didn't I?
Nature, you said.
Nations, excuse me. Thank you, David. America was to be the first nation created intentionally by thought and moral choice. Now, we did fight a rather dandy little revolutionary war, but that was to secure something that had already been chosen. First nation to do that. Now, it's an interesting thing. Franklin alone is kind of a neat guy for us. I told him he's kind of randy, and I shouldn't be so cruel, because something about him that's so interesting is he finds these ideas in common, ordinary life. He says, we don't know Franklin because we don't know this meeting place between the worlds that Franklin can represent for us. He is a symbol of the search in ordinary life. He's not a religious man. He's not even really a particularly profound thinker. Yeah, he does a lot of great things. He's a Renaissance man. But what he does is he finds all this inside of just ordinary life. We love, it says, we trust the official religious saints, perhaps, who achieve sanctity through retreating from worldly life, but not Franklin. Franklin is, like I said, he is neck deep in this world. He is a worldly guy, but he comes up with otherworldly notions. Now, this is a favorite thing of mine. I hope you guys will forgive me. This is a life mask of George Washington. This is what the guy looked like, staring back at us. And when we think about Washington, he's somebody now, I'm going to show you a slide in a second, of his monuments being, his statues being defaced and torn down. He's one of the most important people that we could really embrace as someone that if we can reconcile with him, we'll find something for us that we might be able to see a tool for understanding greater things for ourselves. And I love the fact that I put this on here for us to see his real face, which is what we're trying to do here, as well as his mythical face, the greatness of him. He says here on page 75, it's impossible to understand the miracle of the Constitutional Convention, the thing that brought about our present governmental system, or for that matter, anything at all about the meaning and origins of the United States, without re-assimilating the figure of George Washington. More perhaps than any other single factor, it was the presence of Washington in the Philadelphia State House that prevented the parties and factions from shattering into dissolution. Those are bold words, but this was the one human being that could make them sit there in a sweltering August and September in Philadelphia, a place not noted for being breezy in the summer, and made them sit there with wigs on and not leave till they had worked out their problems. Following the signing of the peace treaty and the British recognition of American independence, this is what is the greatness of Washington. I mentioned this a little bit last time. Washington stunned the world when he surrendered his sword to the Congress on December 23rd, 1783, and retired to his farm at Mount Vernon. This self-conscious and unconditional withdrawal from power and politics was a great moral action, full of significance for an entitled and republicanized world, and the results were monumental. Two things about this. First of all, unlike oh goodness, I'm trying to think of somebody, but Napoleon, Caesar, when they won the battles, they kept power. He walked away from this, but also it gave him the moral ascendancy to be able to do what he did in Philadelphia when we sat down to create our Constitution. This is the sadness, though. If you look over this image on the right, this is a defacing of one of Washington's statues. He says, in being ourselves untrue to the highest teachings of the American tradition, we of this generation have tended to degenerate that tradition, to seek out all that was unworthy, to emphasize whatever justifies national distrust. And so doing, we've discarded an invaluable heritage. We are blinding our eyes to stars that lead to the very ideals many of us most admire the sanctity of the individual, the equality of everyone. Page 80. That was a stirring moment to think we would do that. He is paradoxical. And if you know me and will sit around me any length of time, if you want to find truth, look for the paradox. A simultaneous existence in Washington of extraordinary selflessness and intense ambition. I truly believe he loved, but he married Martha for the property, for the step up in social standings. He was a climber. Dispassion and passion, non-action and boldness, heart-rending gentleness and terrifying ferocity, invites us not only to ponder the paradoxical qualities of human nature as such, but those two men in battle, the existence within every human being of traits of personalities totally at odds with each other, but also to consider another feature of his nature, equally well documented by his biographers, namely his striving and his capacity to see his faults as they really were and to work on freeing himself from them. If anyone has had the pleasure of sitting down and reading Washington's book of, I always call it Virtues, but that's not it. What was the book that you all read that was named after his book?
The Rules of Civility.
Rules of Civility. If you've ever read these, you sit there and wonder what human being does this. But these were actually things he wrote to himself about how to improve and perfect himself. It's actually quite a tidy little book. It's in my family's bathroom. My children do not read it. But if we wanted to step away from God and just kind of look at some things here, but bear with me, this is Franklin's American Creed that he has listed on page 93 in the book. There is one God who made all things. So far, so good, right? That he governs the world by his providence. I'm right there with him so far. That he ought to be worshiped with adoration, prayer, and thanksgiving. No problem. But the most acceptable service of God is doing good to man. I'm a little on the shaky side with him on that one because I think that we owe God something directly. But then he says that the soul is immortal. He's got me back. And the God will certainly reward virtue and punish vice either here or hereafter. Well, I kind of count on God forgiving me for my sins, but I'm willing to agree with the fact that there is an accountability of things. And what Franklin's kind of arguing here is these are the things we hold in our combinations with each other, in our interactions with each other. The idea that, that there is a divine nature, but something that we're supposed to show ourselves by being active in this world. It kind of harkens back to what I try to say about the Theotokos. And this philosophical origins of American nation lies in the hope of creating a social order in which the individual is free to search for the inner change that develops men and women in authentic, inwardly free individuals. I've shown here Lewis and Clark. But the idea that this drives us out into the world, it makes us conquer a continent. At the same time, and we're going to talk about this next time, while we're doing that with such fine, noble ideals and the statements of manifest destiny, next week we're going to be looking at what it means with respect to slavery and Native Americans. What Needleman calls next week the sins of America. But we still have those pinnings. When those things went out, with all the people that might have been thinking about profit and gain, I think just to illustrate one thing very quickly that's kind of off my mind and my script, but bear with me. When the entire continent had been settled and was essentially in the hands of the United States, of all places, South Dakota wanted to build a monument. And they wanted to build a monument because they thought that geographically, they were the center of the country. And interestingly, what they felt was it was their moral obligation to recognize that because they wanted to be the moral center as well as the geographic center. And I think that's telling. It's a state, a literal state, South Dakota, that wanted to look for meaning to the point that they were going to make almost their state identity to be the moral balancing point of a country. And I think that speaks volumes for this ideal. Now, interestingly, in his closing his closing addresses to America when he retired from being president, he brings up this idea of what to warn us against. Now, there's the infamous foreign entanglements. We all remember that. It's a very different world than he was in when he was writing this, when he was speaking this to the Congress. But he uses this phrase, drawn out by Needleman, in biblical language. Those with the gifts of what are called the peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers from the Beatitudes. Understanding the word peace as the Greek eirene, the reconciliation of mutually opposing forces under presiding vision of the good of the whole. Such a capacity within the individual and by an individual in the role of leader allows and even requires that parts of the social body or parts of oneself strongly confront each other, but not as enemies to be destroyed. He didn't like the idea of political parties, certainly factions. Now, this thing on the left here, you all hopefully recognize the fasci. This is getting a bad rap nowadays, and it's done out of ignorance, I'm ashamed to say. This symbol comes from ancient Rome, but it's the idea, you see, it's individual little rods on this axe that are tied together. The idea of the fasci that was done in Rome and was used in the imagery as iconography of the United States is e pluribus unum, out of many, one, and that we are stronger together than we are divided. I'll show you in a minute an image that includes the well of the Senate, or the House rather, and on either side of the speaker's dais are fasces. Other places I'll point out to you during this presentation that show this thing. Now, he talks about Washingtonian democracy, or what Needleman calls mythic democracy, is the circulation of higher intelligence and will through the parts as the parts become separate from one, as the parts both separate, form, and confront each other. To have unity, it is necessary to have right separation so that the parts are free to relate to each other as aspects of the whole. Again, this idea of unity, this idea of being one. And all of this goes right into the ideas of Christianity, the idea of, when St. Paul talks about us being the body, can the foot do without the hand? Can the head look at the eye and say, I don't need you anymore? And so he addresses, oddly enough, the idea of the role of religion in government. The life of the nation as a whole must proceed within the fabric of religious or religiously moral ideas. He's leaving it open for you, saying you don't have to believe in God if you really don't want to, but you need to hold on to some religiously moral ideas. That can be no democracy and no social survival where social order is based only on self-interest of the parts or the individual. Where we are right now, I have to say, I think you would probably agree. I think this is really interesting. I used to show, when I was teaching a class in the history of religion in America, I used to show kids history of religion in America. I would show them a movie called Conspiracy, which is taken from the transcripts of the Wannsee Conference in Nazi Germany. And it's an actual reenactment of what occurred in that meeting where they decided the fate of the Jews, final solution. And there were lawyers in there, not religious, but lawyers, but there were also some Lutherans and things like that. And it was sad to see, without the moral imperatives of this idea of a religious moral ideals, they were susceptible to threatening, and they didn't keep to their moral ideas. The individual was threatened with being picked up by the Gestapo, and they all said, on second thought, we'll kill him, sure, count on me. He says here, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, Washington says, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And I use this image of a broken compass being held by somebody's hand. We have ideals, but without something to point us in the way and to be a true north that's not open to the vagaries and fluctuations. This is the real challenge for us. But there is still this idea of religious liberty. whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education, the mind of peculiar structure, reason, and experience, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principles. That's Washington. But he says a religion that is not freely chosen is not religion, and a freedom that is not in its deepest sense religious is not freedom. But he also says that even the choice to say, I will not adhere to any particular religion. There's another image that's actually created from that life mask. That is probably the best we're ever going to see this side of the resurrection, what old George looked like. In sum, Needleman says, the mythic Washington now emerges as a symbol of a new meaning of virtue for our time, or rather, of the ancient hidden meaning of virtue that has existed throughout all times, and which needs to be heard anew in our culture. The stepping back, I love this phrase, the idea of not being thrown all the way in. The stepping back is the intensely and uniquely human act of freeing oneself from attachment to the whirlpool of life. His detachment, his willingness to leave power behind. This is the great virtue of Washington. Let's take him back home. Now, Jefferson, we're going to spend less time on him. I wanted to focus a little bit more on Washington. We're sitting here right now at about 15 after, and I'm going to try and respect y'all's time. I hope I'm not losing you. Democracy is the communal self. Now, if there's anybody in America today that's going to get a black eye, it's Thomas Jefferson. Robert De Niro made fun of him on Saturday Night Live with Sally Hemings, the slave that he apparently had several children with. It's an interesting relationship, by the way, as just an aside. Sally had the opportunity to be free. When they moved to France, her brother came, who was a freed slave, and with her children in France, she was no longer legally able to be kept as a slave by Jefferson when he was there as ambassador to France. She elected to go back to Virginia with him. Not because her children were being held, all of her family